Good morning from Minnesota, which is where I am in the United States, and good afternoon to those in Europe, and sharing a good morning in Brazil. I will be speaking in English, and hoping that will work well for everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a special pleasure to be here to support Mark, who has been a part of our collective team, not only in this movement for NCDs, but also part of our foundation family, and helped shape a lot of the work that I'll be able to discuss with you today. So why don't I turn quickly to a presentation, which will be a bit easier to cover some of the comments that I'm having today. So I hope this will work. I'm still, even after all of this time on Zoom, I am still learning my way. So I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So let me first tell you a little bit about Medtronic Foundation. Medtronic Foundation, again, I hope you were seeing this. There we go. Medtronic Foundation is a corporate foundation, which is very different from a private foundation or a community foundation. And I want to start there because oftentimes we think about a corporate foundation in very similar ways as the Gates Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation. A corporate foundation actually brings a very different set of assets to a problem. We bring, of course, financial resources, but they're calibrated in the same way with the same expectations as a business would be expecting from financial resources that they provide. But what's unique, in addition to the financing, is the power of employees that corporations have at their disposal. They're highly skilled in the area that's important for the company, and they're highly motivated to give back and advance social issues. And so the combination of what a corporation can provide through its foundation is the financing, as well as the power of the employees that come together. And then certainly there are product donations and a variety of other things that come into play. But this real combination of people and their talent plus financial resources are the differentiators of what makes a corporate foundation different. And for us, and if you don't know Medtronic is the world's largest and first-in-class medical technology company. The pacemaker, the implantable pacemaker, was founded and discovered at Medtronic. And so healthcare, of course, is a big part of what we drive, in addition to bringing much more technology in the way that the company responds. So moving forward, health for the underserved is a big component of what Medtronic Foundation does, but also inspiring our employees to give wherever they live around the world. So to put a little more kind of a local feel of what we've done, let me share a quick video on what we've been doing in Brazil in the past.
Nós temos uma responsabilidade, posso dizer, ampliada, que é atender às demandas, em especial de saúde. A nossa região, ela tem um índice muito grande de pacientes hipertensos e diabéticos também. Teoflotone, que tem cerca de 142 mil habitantes, nós cuidamos, na verdade, de mais de 1 milhão de habitantes. Por ser uma cidade que se localiza no interior do estado de Minas Gerais, os recursos são escassos, a demanda ela é muito grande. É justamente por entender que sozinha uma prefeitura não consegue chegar a lugar algum. Essa parceria que possibilitou esse programa, ela deu uma condição de viabilizar um cuidado mais especial com essas pessoas. Portanto, os pacientes hipertensos e diabéticos aqui do nosso município, das 10 outras cidades também, eles passaram a ter uma oportunidade de um atendimento. Isso já começou a impactar diretamente na vida das pessoas, tanto por meio dos diagnósticos e dos acompanhamentos, quanto também dessa via de mão dupla em que a gente possibilita uma troca de informações, ou seja, é uma parceria em que a rede pública de saúde ela ganha, porque ela recebe o know-how, em especial desses parceiros.
It's so wonderful to see what the world was like before COVID, and we were going so deep in what we could do in communities, and especially in NCDs. And of course, what happened right soon after that was that we were now facing COVID. And hopefully I can move our slides a little further. All right, let's try something else. So our response then shifted to COVID. But in order to figure out how best to equip our response, we needed to come back to what our focus areas were. And so what we did was recast what our main focus areas are. And I hope you can see my screen here. We really focus on global health, which you just saw some of the work that we did in Brazil. We went deep in engaging our employees, not just in considering them as volunteers, but really taking their skills as technical assistants and how best they can get involved. But where we really started to activate even more was in what we do in investing in our communities, because now we were inside of a global pandemic, which meant every community that we were in was directly involved. All three of these areas have been a part of what Medtronic Foundation has been moving in, but the pandemic brought forward the true response that we needed to move forward. And so how did we respond? We had two major issues that were happening at the same time. As I introduced myself, I said I was from Minneapolis. And if you're watching the news over what happened over the summer, racial injustice in the United States, which has always been known, and in every community around the country has been fired up more than this year. But because of what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, that ignited what many of us will say is a global movement for an equity response and social justice. Because our home is here, our operational headquarters was right here in the Twin Cities, that ignited a response for us. We came home very quickly, and that piece that I told you about community was very real, very fast. And so we had a response that came together around social justice, in addition to what we were doing for COVID. In social justice, like in many communities around the world, I come from India, my parents came from India, we see, and I know in Brazil, you've done a great deal there and see the same. Social injustice is happening across the board. In the United States, racially, it is really because of what's happened with systemic racism, especially with the Black community. But in every community around the world, these kinds of hierarchies are there. And so for us in the United States, we started with looking at education and how do we ensure that we're able to help the Black community get more and greater access and opportunity to higher levels of education. What this brought to us is also a realization that we've got to think through how does inequity and justice show up in communities all around the world so that we can provide the best response. And we know in healthcare, if we're not dealing with that, we're not going to get to the levels of access for the underserved. When we come back to COVID-19, it was very interesting in terms of what we needed to do. We found very quickly that we needed to pivot our work. We had long-running relationships with a lot of nonprofits around the world, including in Brazil, but it pushed us fast to come back to basics and listening. What is it that is needed right now? What is the health system grappling with? And is there anything that not only we as a foundation can do, but we as a company? And so as you may have recalled, I started our discussion reminding us that Medtronic innovated the pacemaker. But believe it or not, we had a business that was around ventilation and ventilators. And in the COVID response, it became incredibly important to quickly scale. What can we do to get ventilation out? The company open sourced, donated the intellectual property around ventilators so that we could support more and more production and local production of the ventilator. So that was a big piece of what we needed to do. But specifically for the foundation, our global health response had always rested on health workers. And in some contexts, we had to explain why. But when COVID happened, we didn't have to explain why at all. Every community around the world understood why the health worker was an important part of their lives and survival, and that healthcare all of a sudden was at all of our doorsteps. We needed to have someone that was equipped and protected to be able to deliver what they could during this response. So our response included responses in Brazil, but anchored on getting PPE distribution going together in partnership with nonprofits. Big contributions to the CDC Foundation and WHO and others who were quickly getting mobilized on the ground, making sure training was happening in COVID and ensuring some telescreening was there. We had to pivot what we were doing in NCDs, which is where our major response was, to be part of the COVID response. And we were able to do that because the health workers were there, because we had already invested there, and because of our partners that were already there. And we've learned that the work that we were doing in Brazil has become best in class for PAHO and the ministry, partly because of this level of investment in what communities are doing and what health workers are doing. And being a best in class isn't really about any one sector. While we're here speaking about NCDs, it's important, but being best in class is really noting that that investment actually mattered across so many more. And we saw this in our COVID response. And so now, as we're just a few months in, right, we haven't even been 1 year into this pandemic or the social and racial injustice issues, we're starting to think through what can we learn, and we bring that even to this conversation here. My background is HIV. Brazil has led the way in so many areas. And so we turn to this conversation and thinking about how can we accelerate the NCD advocacy that's happening now, but based on what we're learning from COVID. Everyone responded fast and we responded together. I was so impressed to see, having been a part of the HIV response, this time companies jumped in fast, no matter what sector they were in. You even saw apparel companies quickly figure out how to make masks. This was a time that was not the same as when it was HIV. We were all here together across sectors. Secondly, how can we shape a global justice and equity response, moving beyond what we might be seeing in the United States, but really now appreciating that these injustices require a response in every context around the world? And how can we quickly scale financing and community engagement? These three things are things that we had to organically do very quickly as a global community this year. And now how do we learn from that and mainstream this as we move into what we need to do going forward? We know that the vaccine will come and it won't be an emergency then. We know it now. So what can we do now to be prepared and united so that we can dispel the myth that somehow we can only come together in emergency, but we don't seem to be able to come together when it's time to respond in something mainstream. And I think for NCDs, that's one of the main things that I know we grapple with. So thank you again, Mark, and to the team here, and I'll turn it back to you.